Hello guys, let me give you my full formal introduction. I am the mechanical engineer working in the power plant and utilities in the petrochemical complex. So I'm a traditional engineer working with the fundamental technologies and techniques. So in past I also worked with the various startups and NGOs. I also worked at IIT Madras on few projects. So the main purpose of this thing is to I want to explore the new methods like data science, not a new method, but I want to use these methods, data science and AI methods, to solve the current traditional problems which we face in the uh, this power plant and utility or energy systems. So the application of data science and AI in the energy systems like petrochemical complex, refineries, power plants, and all these things is really fascinates me. So I'm going to explore this stuff. And for practicing the data science and data science projects, I want to cover the project from the ground up. So a lot of projects on the YouTube are really from the Pythonic projects. They are like they dive really they go directly into the coding stuff, and they don't cover the why we going to do this project from very ground up. So we will some the projects which I will cover here. I will go through very basics like why we gonna need this project, what are the requirements of this, what are the key stakeholders which we need this project to be successful, why they want this project to execute, and what are their requirements to fulfill. So let's take this very fast, very simple project. This is the Indian economic analysis. We're gonna cover the Indian economic patterns from 1960 to 2020. Is In this period we're gonna explore really some patterns that are going through this. So first thing is to identify what are our key stakeholders. So stakeholders are the economists. We want to study the market patterns. The investors want to find the opportunities to invest in India, and what are the outlook going to be. And finance ministry, and they know that I'm not into finance much more. So basically what could be the work that can that are required. They want to study the behavior of Indian economy. They want to analyze patterns. They want to predict the behavior in future, how they're going to be in future. Is there any positive or negative? What is the outlook? Are there any opportunities for investment or not? And for mainly for the decision making and policy forming, so that they can maintain the financial stability and improve the Indian economy over time. So these are the very example few basic requirements like I've gathered. So how is India's GDP and GDP growth change over years? Find anomalies and noticeable changes and their reasons possibly. The anomalies is the something like that's not regular, that's out of region. And noticeable changes means sudden growth, sudden contraction in the economy. The import export changes over time. And is India becoming self-reliant or trade dependent? Means if is India able to produce their own demand? Is India can fulfill their own demand or not, or they rely on the foreign trades, foreign goods and services too for that. What is the trade balance? Is export dominates or import dominates? Is that and what is the GDP per capita and life expectancy and their interrelationships? If the GDP per capita increases, life expectancy increases, means really good thing. Inflations and GDP growth. So inflation is basically like year per year price increase for specific goods and services. For example, in real estate, if you observe like some flats or some lands were of 20 lakhs 10 years ago, now they are 2 crores, means they have a growth over 1010 times, means 1000 percentage. And this is the inflation means for the price increase, like they just don't carry this particular thing. But RBI and the finance ministry, they cover that of whole goods and services, like cover entire spectrum of goods and services, and find the average increase in that thing. The inflation, healthy inflation is around 4 to 6% maybe. I don't know, but this is the rough figure they try to maintain it, and RBI maintains a repo rate to control these inflations. Okay. Correct me if I'm wrong in the mention in the comment. The total reserves, including gold, the reserves are things which have been into the central banks, which we carry, which we put in the central bank to maintain the economic stability, and some sudden shocks on to resist sudden shocks and that sort of thing, and carry कभी कभी लोन लेने के लिए. Suppose COVID आ गया तो economic activity has been gone down, and for that part and in that period of time we need loans to be, we need to rely on some sort of externality to help us. In that time the reserves count, or reserves also may help maintain the price of like our strength of currency, the population growth and GDP growth over time. So suppose the population is growing rapidly but GDP is not growing rapidly, means GDP per capita will reduce, or like this GDP growth per capita also only. So we'll analyze that and find the correlations between them, life expectancy and population growth. Suppose the population growth is declining, the life expectancy should be increasing. So we'll also find some patterns in it, if it holds the current theory or not. Total reserves influence inflation and economic stability. Any periods where high inflations accounted in GDP growth per capita growth over time. Okay. So let's go through some key economic terms. What is GDP? GDP is a gross domestic product, which is monetary value of all kind of goods and services produced within supposed specified time. Okay. For example, we are gonna look for this current financial year. Financial year is between 1st April to 31st March. Okay. So in between period we'll calculate all the goods and services produced, its monetary value, and it generally shows country's economic output. It's an indicator of like company's economic size and output, used to compare economics of on the global scale. Like if suppose India's GDP is higher than the France or maybe Germany, that's where we compare the performance of various countries. So we have some also interrelations between them. GDP just affects not only GDP but various terms which can affect. Okay. So what is GDP per capita? GDP per capita is a GDP per person. Like for example, so for simplicity, it's it's representing the average creation or earning per person. Okay. GDP per growth. GDP growth percentage means economic expansion or contradiction indicator. The economic size GDP total GDP compared with the previous GDP. Okay. Population growth. How the population's grown from the previous year. It also suppose the population growth and in the positive side, and GDP remains constant, then it will decrease the GDP per capita. Population also increases, like positive populations also increase the import demand. Suppose there is a lower mortality rate, people don't die so easily, then the population will increase. And it also says, like suppose populations, there is a metric of all the growth and developed countries, that if the population is declining, then that does identify that there is economic growth is happening. Inflation. What is inflation? Inflation is, I mentioned that the percentage change in the consumer prices And it also signifies the cost of living of particular city. Like for example, inflation in the Delhi is very high, means prices of goods and services are very high in the Delhi compared to in the rural areas. So the cost of living in the Delhi is typically much high and you have to earn very high in order to survive there. So it does identify the cost of living. So higher inflations is not attractive because it cannot provide very good services for particular unit of money. Deflation is also not attractive because there is no growth, there is no economic expansion. It's doesn't that doesn't increase the economic activity of country. So high GDP can fuel high inflations, means uh, average income of everyone in the country is increasing. For example, the youth which is increasing in the India have gotten very good opportunities in the India. They are getting very good salary and they are opportunities about investing in the they are like really buying stuff. That's why there is a very increasing demand of retail. There is increasing demand of fashionable services, fashionable retail stores. There is a very so there is demand, which means that is crossing the supply. Means there will be the price increase, and which will fuel the inflation. The life expectancy years at birth. It's like when you are born, what is the life expected of you based on the average. So it depends upon the social health, also indicates nutrition, healthcare and living standards. Import, which is percentage of GDP, it's like a dependency on the foreign goods and services. So we depend upon the, for example, we are importing the machineries from the China, then we rely on China to provide us. Okay, so that's indicates dependency. And export, which means we able to produce our own goods, but we are also providing goods and services to the foreign, which will create which will create the GDP growth. And total reserves, assets held by central bank, gold, foreign currency reserves and assets, which acts as a shield against economic shocks such as COVID, 2008 crash, wars, geopolitical stuff. There is Russia and Ukraine thing. Okay, that sort of things. What are the interrelations between the GDP? So GDP directly proportional to import and export. Suppose there is a higher export, the GDP will be higher, and the more export is, there may be possibility that there is a higher import. Okay. GDP, the higher GDP countries now they tend to reserve more into the reserves to maintain the financial stability and maintain the currency strength. GDP is directly related to the population. So larger the population is, more the GDP is. Okay. So GDP per capita, and that is different. GDP per capita doesn't depend on the population. So GDP per capita is a function of GDP and population growth, means GDP per population. It's a unit measure of per person. So GDP per capita, it increases, then life expectancy also increases. Means they can able to buy quality healthcare, nutrition, better facilities and better standards of living. Okay. It also drives the import and export. The higher earning individuals would like to buy some very costly stuff from the foreign. They demand increase the import, and also they fuel the demand, which will generate the economics and sort of things. Imports and exports. Imports are dependent upon the GDP growth, total reserves. If suppose imports are very high, then we're gonna deploy our currency, and to maintain that we need to increase our total reserves, which will The depletion in the reserves will cause our currency to get weak, so we need to add more resources into the reserves, typically gold and US dollars. The imports also limit GDP per capita. The export, which stabilizes the inflation. uh, GDP growth increases boosts GDP per capita as discussed. Total reserves means strong exports. Financial stability and resistance. There is, as I talked this earlier, total reserves maintain financial stability, long-term GDP growth. Good. The inflation. The higher GDP growth, which means demand is higher than supply, the price of goods increases, and as price increases, there is the inflation. Okay. Reduce export competitiveness. So if the price of goods is increasing in your country, then the goods to produce will be also costlier, and the if the other countries are less inflation, the cost to produce that particular set of goods is lesser, then we cannot able to export that good outside, because the price in our country, price in India, is higher than the price in suppose Australia. Then suppose for example there is iPhone. Okay, it's also made in India and made in Australia. The labor cost in India, let's take this Vietnam. Okay, because the labor cost of in India is higher than Vietnam. Then the cost of price of this product will also be increasing and price of Vietnam. So iPhones are very costlier to make in India than in Vietnam. Then Apple will choose Vietnam over India. Okay, so this is the price economics. These are the theories have been covered. So now you have the clear idea of how these things are. So our stakeholders have few questions we need to answer, and I have created the code. Okay, see, this is the code. I got this Kaggle notebook in which I will use the data of Indian Note Bank, Central Bank or something like that. And let's take this pen. Okay. This is the data set we are using. This sorry this is the table in which the data is. There is a country. Okay, GDP per capita, GDP growth, import, export, total reserves, inflation, prices, population growth, life expectancy, etc. These are the columns. So for the answering the first question, how is India's GDP and GDP growth change over the years? Is there any noticeable change or anomalies? So I've tried to plot this two stuff like India's GDP and GDP growth. There is a GDP and GDP growth, column number 1, 2, 3, and column number 5. Okay, I try to plot that onto this line graph. It's because this is a time series data from 1960s to 2020. So we need to analyze this over the time frame. So I tried to I use this line time series data and plot it against the line. So there's in the red there is GDP growth, and in the blue there is GDP. Okay, the GDP in the 90s 60s is been nearly constant till 1990s, and then they shoot up rapidly. So there is any anomalies there is anomaly of 1965, at which there is a war between India and Pakistan. So there is a negative GDP growth in that part. There is a steep decline in 1979. There might be some Iranian crude oil stuff that happened. Therefore, there is a uh, that thing was I don't know detail incident. I will share in later. So that was the problem, and later on there is a after the 2019 and 2020. This part has been hit by COVID. Therefore, there is a steep decline in the GDP growth, which is from plus 7.5% to negative 7.5%, and there is a also decline in the GDP. So 2.7 trillion to 2.5 trillion something. Okay, that's a huge loss. Now we're gonna cover up some statistics. So this is the statistics, you can read. We also find this anomalies like 1965, 1979, 2020. In this period there is some events that happened. You can provide it to the finance minister for that purpose. How much they changed, other parameters that affected also been covered. So how the second question is how the imports and exports over time changes. Is India becomes self-reliant or trade dependent over time? So we need to answer this question. For that we're gonna cover the data of import and exports, the imports and exports. Okay, I've also plotted that against time. So the Y column is the percentage of GDP and trend of imports and exports. Okay, so over time there is yellow line is of imports and green line of exports. So over time we are seeing that during 1970s the balance was pretty good. The imports were nearly equal to the exports, but then after that, after 2000, imports were quite regularly shooting up than the exports. There is a significant difference in year 2011 to 15. Imports are really high as percentage of GDP. They are hitting almost like 30% of GDP, and exports are 25% of GDP. So there is trade balance that's not good. Okay, and the trade balance mean is minus 1.86, means the exports are minus 1.6% lesser than the imports, and maximum is minus 6.73, means at that time only, maybe here, because there is a 6.66% difference here. We're gonna cover the next questions. What is the relationship between the GDP per capita and life expectancy at birth over time? Does economic growth correlate with improvements in life expectancy? So here we want to see the economic growth and relationship between life expectancy. So see that there is a steady increase of GDP over time, and the life expectancy has been linearly increased from the 1960s. At the 1960s, life expectancy was 40 years, and because there was a higher death rate, so average is lesser. There is a life expectancy at the 2020 was nearly 70 years, 60 to 70 years. Okay, sorry, 70 years also. Means that it signifies the average age of human being that to live has been increased. How does the inflation, means the consumer prices, affect GDP growth? Is there any strong positive or negative correlation? For that we also plotted this graph, in which we can see there is a blue line is inflation and green line is GDP growth. The GDP growth has sudden peaks uh, at here, here, we cannot recommend this as a particular set of things because there might be some theories that work, some might not work. Therefore, we can also see that sometimes that is linearly proportionate or sometimes it is inversely proportionate. So we cannot recommend this as a theory. So let's keep it as a plot. Let the financial analysis do the analysis. We go to next question. Is there any correlation between the total reserves, includes gold, and trends in import export? Okay, if we plotted that, green line is of import and blue line is of total reserves. The reserves have been increased steeply in this period from 2014 to 2020. There's been a very good amount of increase in here, while the imports have been drops. Okay, so you can say it's a pretty good condition here. How does a population growth impact the GDP growth? Does higher population growth rate coincide with higher or lower GDP growth? It means it will be lower. The population has been declining. Growth has been declining means the population which is growing is decreasing. Its growth means the population increases but its growth percentage decreases. Population will be continue to grow. So in this part, there is a population has been growing at 1960 around 2.1%, 2.3%. Currently it is growing at 0.7%. So it's has been growth rate has been decreased, but populations will continue to increase, and there will be a point around here where population will be at 0% and starts negative growth. So this cycle will continue like something. So we are at here point, it will grow negative growth, then over time there might be a 2070 or something where we're gonna give a negative peak of negative growth, the population of age olds also. That's really good interpretation of the stuff. How is India's populations have evolved and what's is effect on the GDP per capita? The total population of GDP and GDP per capita over time. There is a population growth and GDP per capita. As population growth decreases, the GDP per capita is increasing. You can say it in the better way. Is there a correlation between life expectancy and population growth? See, the life expectancy has been increasing, population growth is decreasing. There is an inverse relationship between them. How do total reserves, including load, influence the inflation and economic stability? So let's say there is inflation of consumer prices in the red. There is a total reserves, and in that part we can see that anomaly is here because is this particular time now there is a 1 high 1 low peak. Maybe like we don't know the reason. We have to find which policy has been implemented in that time that limited the population, that which situation caused inflation to shoot up, and which policy implemented that declined the inflation so that it hit the negative bottom, and then it come basically to this side. From 2000 to 2008 something, the inflation rate is nearly constant, and from now on it started to increase. Okay, any periods of high inflation are associated with any significant changes in GDP growth or GDP per capita? Okay, so there is a total reserves has been increasing and inflation that we cannot see any clear insights from here. Let financial analyst do the analysis of this thing, because we need to dig deeper into this data. Plot doesn't show anything right here. These are really interesting questions which we need to answer in the next phase. There are some sort of economic resilience and policy impact questions, like how India's total reserves fluctuated during the major global financial crisis or economic shocks, and what was the impact on the GDP growth. These are really good questions. Really good questions. As the inflation affected real income growth, approximated using GDP per capita and adjusted for inflation. Yes. Are periods of high export correlated with reduction in inflation, indicating economic stabilization? They are really good questions. We will answer in this next phase. This you can go through my Kaggle and find this code. I've included all these questions in that part. Yeah, we can also find the emerging trends and future predictions. How do GDP growth and GDP per capita trends aligns with the goals of major national initiatives, Make in India, Atmanirbhar Bharat? So here we will account for policy changes and how this policy impact the economic indicators. We're gonna cover this in really detail from next part. So if you are interested, you can mention like what kind of questions you need, so I can analyze that part and provide answers for that. So this was the data requirements gathering, and this part we have answered all these questions. Okay, all this question has been answered. I also provided the additional questions at the bottom. So thank you for being here very much. So let me tell you why I'm doing this. I'm just experiment. This is just an experiment. I don't want to gain any financial things or maybe like following. I don't need at all. Okay, I just here to increase my skills related to the explanation, communication and sort of things. I also be in a good time. I've brought a new tab, so I want to use it wisely therefore. And thank you for being here. If you need anything, you can contact me over my LinkedIn, GitHub, personal mail, WhatsApp. I don't provide Twitter. Okay, you can reach my any handle. I'll try to help as much as possible. And I'm a data Greek. Will provide various things that normally you won't find in the other stuff. Try to provide as much as possible. And thanks for being here. We'll be meeting next part. Thank you.